The hills around Bethlehem were quiet at night. Long after the last light had faded from the village, the slopes beyond the houses rested beneath the open sky. The paths that wound between the stones had grown still. The fields, dry in some places and green in others, stretched gently toward the darker shapes of distant hills. Above them, the stars were clear. There were no lamps along the hillsides, no roads filled with travelers, no sound of a busy city, only the occasional movement of a sheep, the soft stirring of grass beneath a night breeze, and now and then the distant call of an animal somewhere beyond the flock. A small fire burned beside a low stone. Its light was modest. It did not push back the whole darkness. It simply made a little circle of warmth in the night. Near the fire sat a young shepherd. His name was David. He was the youngest son of Jesse, a man of Bethlehem in Judah. David was still young, and his life seemed at first to be a simple one. He tended his father's sheep. That was his work, while his older brothers carried responsibilities that seemed more important. David spent long hours beyond the village. He knew the slopes and paths. He knew where the flock liked to graze. He knew the sound of sheep moving together, and the particular sound of one sheep wandering away. He knew the hills in sunlight, and he knew them in darkness. There was a certain peace that came when the day had finally grown quiet. The sheep settled close together. The fire gave a little warmth. The wind passed over grass. David could sit beneath the stars and listen. Perhaps there were nights when he played his lyre. The scriptures later remembered David as a musician, a man who could play skillfully upon the lyre. We are not told every song he played as a young shepherd, nor every night when his fingers move across its strings. But we know that David became a man who sang. And so, in the imagination of a quiet night in Bethlehem, we can picture the young shepherd with his instrument beside him, the flock resting nearby, and the ancient hills listening. The notes would have been small beneath the enormous sky. A few gentle sounds, then silence, another few notes, then the wind. David might have looked toward the darkness beyond the flock and seen the faint outline of the hills. He might have lifted his eyes toward the stars, the same stars that had watched over generations before him, the same heavens that stretched above the tents and fields of Abraham, the same moon that moved quietly above the land of Isaac and Jacob. And David, still young, sat beneath them with his sheep. There was nothing grand about the scene. No royal robes, no palace, no army, no throne, only a shepherd, only sheep, only a small fire, only the quiet hills of Bethlehem. And yet, without knowing it, David was living through a season that would remain deeply connected to his life. The years of the shepherd, the years when much of his world was hidden, the years when he learned to wait, the years when he learned the sound of silence, the years when his heart was formed far from the eyes of crowds. The night grew cooler. David drew his cloak a little closer. One of the sheep shifted in its sleep. He listened, then the flock settled again. The fire gave a quiet crackle, and the shepherd remained awake. The quiet shepherd. David's days were shaped by repetition. Morning came. The light spread over the hills. The sheep stirred. David rose. The flock moved. The sun climbed. The sheep grazed. The shepherd watched. There were paths to follow and water to find. There were moments when sheep needed to be guided back toward the others. There were places where the flock could rest in the shade. Nothing happened quickly. A shepherd could not hurry the grass into growing. He could not command the sheep to become patient. He simply led them and watched and waited. Perhaps this was one of the first quiet lessons David learned. Some things could not be forced. The hills had their own rhythm. The sheep had theirs. The morning had its own pace. The evening had its own pace. And David had to learn to live within them. The Bible tells us that David cared deeply for the flock. There came a time when he would tell Saul that as a shepherd, he had defended his father's sheep when a lion or a bear carried one away. David pursued the animal, rescued the sheep, and struck the predator. It was a dangerous part of his work. But the shepherd's life was not defined by danger. Most of the time, it was defined by patience, by attention, By being present, the sheep did not need David to impress them. They needed him to remain near. They needed him to notice. They needed him to know the landscape. They needed him when the path became difficult. And perhaps, over the long months and years, David came to understand something about care. To care for something was often simply to remain faithful to it, to keep watch, to return, to stay. There were probably long afternoons when very little changed. The sheep grazed, the grass moved in the wind, a bird passed overhead, the sun slowly crossed the sky. David could look toward Bethlehem and seen the village resting beneath the warmth. His father's house was there. His brothers were there. But David's place was often beyond them, out among the sheep. Solitude can seem empty at first, but slowly, solitude becomes a kind of room, a room without walls, a place where the mind becomes quieter, a place where small things become noticeable. The sound of wind against grass, the warmth of sunlight on a stone, the movement of clouds across a distant ridge, the sound of sheep breathing as they settle for the night. Perhaps David noticed these things. Perhaps he learned the difference between the sound of ordinary wind and the sound that came before a storm. Perhaps he knew which paths were familiar. Perhaps he remembered where the flock had found water the day before. A shepherd learns a landscape by walking through it repeatedly. And David walked, day after day, season after season. The hills became familiar. The valleys became familiar. The night sky became familiar. And in that quiet familiarity, David's life was taking shape, not loudly, not quickly, almost invisibly. Sometimes the evening light over Bethlehem would turn the hills gold. The flock would move slowly toward a resting place. David would walk behind them, his staff in his hand, his harp nearby, his shadow stretching across the ground. The sun would sink lower. The sky would change from blue to pale gold, then rose, then violet. The first stars would appear, one, then another, then many. The village below would begin to disappear into darkness. The shepherd would light a small fire, and once again night would settle around him. There is something peaceful about a fire in a dark landscape. The fire does not conquer the night. It simply exists within it. A little warmth, a little light, enough to see the faces of the sheep closest to him, enough to see his hands, enough to see the instrument resting beside him. Beyond that small circle, darkness remained. And David did not need to understand everything that darkness contained. He only needed to remain faithful to the flock entrusted to him. So he watched. The sheep slept. The fire burned. The stars remained above. And the young shepherd waited for morning. The heart of a shepherd. There are parts of David's early life that Scripture tells us directly, and there are parts we can only approach through the songs and prayers that later came from his life. The Psalms give us a window into the kind of heart David carried. Not a perfect heart. Not a heart that never became afraid. Not a heart that never felt lonely, but a heart that repeatedly turned toward God. This makes the image of David the shepherd especially tender. A young man alone beneath the night sky, a flock sleeping nearby, a harp in his hands, and somewhere within him, words beginning to form. Perhaps not every song was written in the fields. Perhaps not every song belongs to the early years. The Bible does not give us a diary of David's shepherd days, but the songs of David allow us to imagine the inner landscape of a man who had learned to speak honestly before God. He knew joy. He knew fear. He knew longing. He knew gratitude. He knew the strange peace that can exist even when circumstances are difficult. And perhaps the hills of Bethlehem were among the first places where he learned that honesty. He did not need an audience. The hills did not applaud. The sheep did not understand his words. The stars remained silent. So David could simply sing. He could sing because the day was beautiful. He could sing because the night was long. He could sing because he was afraid. He could sing because he was grateful. He could sing because there was nothing else to say. The harp would make a soft sound in the darkness. A few strings, a pause, another phrase, then silence. The sound would disappear into the hills, and David would remain. There's a gentleness in that picture, a person making music that no one else may hear, not performing, not proving anything, simply giving voice to what is inside. Perhaps this was part of what solitude taught him. There are prayers that do not need to be polished. There are songs that do not need to be heard. There are thoughts that can simply be carried into the quiet presence of God. David's later songs often return to the language of shepherding. He would one day write of the Lord as his shepherd. He would speak of green pastures, still waters, paths of righteousness, a valley shadowed by death, a table prepared in the presence of enemies, goodness and mercy following him. These words belong to the mature story of David, but they carry the imagery of the shepherd, the man who knows what it means to lead a flock, the man who knows what it means to search for water, the man who knows that sheep can wander, the man who knows that danger can appear without warning, the man who knows the comfort of having someone near. And so perhaps, as David looked after his father's sheep, he was slowly learning to understand his own life through the language of the flock. A shepherd walks ahead. A shepherd watches behind. A shepherd knows the path. A shepherd stays near. And a shepherd does not abandon the flock simply because the hills become dark. Night after night, David learned the stars. Perhaps he knew no names for most of them. He did not need to. He could simply look. The sky was immense. The hills were small. The shepherd was smaller still. And yet he was not forgotten. That was the quiet conviction growing in him. The God of Israel was not confined to a building, not limited to daylight, not absent from the wilderness. God was there. David could not see him, but he could look at the heavens. He could hear the wind. He could feel the cold air. He could watch the sheep settle. He could remember the stories of his people. The God who had called Abraham, the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt, the God who had remained faithful through generations, the God of his father Jesse, the God of Israel. David's faith did not require the hills to become spectacular. The ordinary was enough. The night was enough. The sheep were enough. The fire was enough. The quiet was enough. He could simply remain there. And perhaps, in those hours when no one else was watching, David became accustomed to the unseen. That would matter later, because much of his life would involve trusting what he could not yet see. Promises before fulfillment, purpose before understanding, a throne before a crown, safety before deliverance, morning before sunrise. The fire slowly became embers. David stirred it. A small flame rose. The sheep slept close together. Above them, the stars remained steady. David sat with his harp. He did not know what the coming years would hold. He did not know that his name would one day be remembered throughout Israel. He did not know that kingship would enter his story. He did not know that his life would contain great joy and deep sorrow. He did not know how long he would have to wait. For now, he was simply David, the shepherd, the youngest son, the one who stayed with the sheep. And perhaps that was enough. The God David could not see. Faith often grows quietly. It does not always arrive with a great moment. Sometimes it grows through repetition. A prayer whispered again, a song sung again, a night survived, a morning received, a fear carried, a small act of courage, then another. David's shepherd years gave him many such moments. The Bible tells us that David defended the flock from predators. That meant he knew fear. A lion was not a small thing. A bear was not a small thing. David was not protected from danger simply because he was young. Yet when danger came, he acted. He did what was necessary. There's something deeply human about that. Courage does not always feel like courage. Sometimes courage is simply staying with what has been entrusted to you. Sometimes it is taking one more step. Sometimes it is reaching for the sheep that has wandered. Sometimes it is standing in the dark because someone must remain awake. David would later speak of the Lord as his refuge and fortress. He would describe God as his rock. These are strong images, but perhaps they became meaningful because David had lived among actual rocks. He knew the shelter of hills. He knew the safety of a familiar path. He knew how quickly weather could change. He knew how vulnerable sheep could be. He knew that a shepherd needed somewhere secure. So when David spoke of God as his refuge, the words were not abstract. They came from a life lived on the land. He understood what it meant to need shelter. He understood what it meant to look for a safe place. He understood what it meant to trust someone stronger than himself. And so beneath the stars, his faith could become simple. God was near. God saw. God knew. David did not have to see everything. He only had to keep walking. There may have been nights when David felt very small. The hills could be vast. The darkness could be deep. The stars could seem impossibly far away. And yet the very vastness of the night could remind him that his life did not depend entirely on his own strength. He could breathe. He could rest. He could watch the flock. He could listen. He could pray. Perhaps he sometimes sang words like those found in the Psalms. That God was his light. That God was his shepherd. That he could lie down without fear. That he could lift his eyes toward the hills. That he could seek refuge beneath God's care. The words might have been quiet, almost spoken under the breath. The kind of prayer that belongs to the night. And after the prayer, the silence would return. Nothing dramatic would happen. The stars would remain. The sheep would sleep. The fire would burn. But perhaps David's heart would become a little steadier. That is sometimes how peace comes. Not by changing the landscape, but by changing the way a person remains within it. Samuel comes to Bethlehem. One day, the quiet rhythm of David's life was interrupted. A man named Samuel came to Bethlehem. Samuel was a prophet of God. He had been sent by the Lord to the house of Jesse. The reason was hidden from Jesse's sons. Samuel had come to anoint one of them as the future king of Israel. The house of Jesse gathered. The atmosphere would have been different from an ordinary day. There was something solemn about Samuel's arrival. He was not merely another traveler passing through Bethlehem. He carried a message from God. Jesse brought his sons before him. One by one, Samuel looked at them. The first son appeared to him impressive. But the Lord told Samuel not to judge by outward appearance. Human beings look at what is visible. God looks at the heart. One son passed. Then another. Then another. The sons continued to stand before Samuel. But the one God had chosen was not among them. At last Samuel asked Jesse if these were all his sons. There was still one, the youngest, David. He was keeping the sheep, so the others waited. And someone went call the shepherd. Imagine that moment quietly, far from the house. Perhaps David was walking among the flock. Perhaps the afternoon light rested on the hills. Perhaps the sheep were feeding. Perhaps David had no idea that anyone was waiting for him. He was simply doing what he had been told to do. Then came the message. Come home. Samuel is here. David left the sheep. He went toward the house. He did not know why. He did not know what was about to happen. He entered. Samuel saw him. David was described as handsome, with beautiful eyes and a pleasing appearance. But the important thing was not his appearance. The Lord had chosen him. Samuel took the horn of oil, and there, in the presence of his brothers, Samuel anointed David. The scripture says that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day forward. It was an extraordinary moment, and yet the Bible tells it simply. Oil, a young shepherd, a prophet, a family gathered in Bethlehem, and the quiet beginning of a future no one could yet see. David had been chosen, but David was still David. The sheep still needed him. The hills were still waiting. Night would still come. The fire would still need to be lit. There is something beautiful about what happened next. David did not immediately become king. He did not leave Bethlehem wearing a crown. He did not step into a palace. He returned to his life, back to the sheep, back to the hills, back to the ordinary. The oil had been poured. The promise had been given. But the waiting continued. This is one of the quietest parts of David's story. The great moment came, and then life became ordinary again. Perhaps that is why it is so comforting. A person can experience something profound and still have dishes to wash, still have work to do, still have ordinary responsibilities, still have to wait. David returned to the flock. The sheep did not know he had been anointed. The hills did not change. The stars remained where they had always been. The same wind passed through the grass. The same path stretched across the land. David was still a shepherd. Only now he carried a secret within him. A future he could not yet see. A promise that would take time. Back to the sheep. That evening, perhaps David once again sat beside the fire. The experience in Bethlehem may have remained in his thoughts. Samuel, the oil, his brothers, the words he had heard, the strange weight of being chosen. But the flock needed tending. One sheep wandered. David rose. He guided it back. Another needed attention. He stayed near. The work continued. Perhaps he wondered about the future. Perhaps he did not. Perhaps he simply watched the sunset. The sun slipped behind the hills. The shadows lengthened. The sheep settled. The fire was lit. Night returned. And David was once again a shepherd beneath the stars. The difference was invisible. No one passing by would have known. There was no crown, no royal robe, no army, no palace, just a young man with a staff and a flock. This is how God's purposes sometimes unfold, quietly, slowly, in ways that do not look important from the outside. The future can begin long before it becomes visible. David could not hurry it, so he waited, and while he waited, he lived. The harp returned to his hands. Perhaps the notes were softer that night. The hills listened, the sheep rested, and the young shepherd looked into the darkness. He had been chosen for something he did not yet understand. But he did not need to understand everything. He could simply be faithful with what was in front of him. The sheep, the path, the night, the song, the next morning. Sometimes the next step is enough. The valley, years would move forward. The story would carry David beyond the shepherd's fields and into the lives of kings and soldiers. But the shepherd would remain within him. Eventually, David's older brothers were in the army of Israel. They were facing the Philistines. Jesse sent David to bring food and news to his brothers. David arrived at the camp, and there he heard the voice of Goliath. The Philistine champion challenged Israel. The army was afraid. David listened. He was troubled not because he thought himself a great warrior, but because Goliath was defying the living God. David's confidence came from the God he had trusted in the fields. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He knew that strength did not begin with a sword. It began with God. David's words to Saul were rooted in his shepherd experience. He had defended his father's flock. He had seen danger. He had learned that the Lord could deliver him. So David went forward. The familiar shepherd's confidence had followed him into the valley. Saul offered him armor. David tried it, but it was unfamiliar. He could not move comfortably in it. So he set it aside. He took his staff. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and he went toward Goliath with the simple equipment of a shepherd. The scene was immense. 2 armies stood facing each other. The valley stretched between them. The Philistine warrior approached. David approached. But the story does not need to become loud. David's faith was quiet. He did not pretend that Goliath was small. He understood the danger, but he believed that the battle ultimately belonged to God. He had learned this in a much smaller place, in the fields, with sheep, with a lion, with a bear, with a shepherd's staff in his hand. Now he stood in the valley, and the Lord gave him victory. The stone struck Goliath, and the Philistine fell. David's victory was decisive. Yet for the purpose of this quiet journey, the important thing is not the noise of the battle. It is what David carried into it. He carried the memory of the hills. He carried the trust learned in solitude. He carried the confidence that had grown through ordinary faithfulness. The shepherd had not become someone else. He had simply brought the shepherd's heart with him. After the valley, David's life became more complicated. People began to notice him. Songs were sung about him. Saul's heart became troubled. The young man who had once been almost invisible was now becoming known, and being known brought danger. David's path became difficult. The palace that might have seemed like a place of honor became a place where he could not always feel safe. Saul's jealousy grew. David had to flee. The shepherd who once walked quietly through the hills now found himself walking through wilderness. Yet even there, the old images remained. Rocks, caves, open skies, long roads, night watches, waiting. David had learned something in Bethlehem that he now needed again. He knew how to wait. The long road ahead. There were years when David lived without the security he might have expected. He had been anointed king, yet he was not yet king. He had been chosen, yet he was hunted. He had served Saul, yet Saul sought his life. David had opportunities to harm Saul, but he refused to take the kingdom into his own hands by killing the man who had been appointed king. He waited. This waiting was not passive. David moved when he needed to move. He hid when he needed to hide. He gathered companions. He traveled through wilderness places. He found shelter in caves. He lived with uncertainty, but he continued to wait for God. There were moments when fear entered his songs. The Psalms preserve that honest voice. David could say that his enemies surrounded him. He could say that his heart was afraid. He could cry out for help. And then, sometimes in the same breath, he could say that he trusted God. This is important. Peace did not mean that David never felt fear. Faith did not mean that he never became weary. Trust did not mean that every night was easy. The Psalms show us something gentler and more truthful. A person can be afraid and still pray. A person can be lonely and still trust. A person can be exhausted and still hope. A person can wait without knowing exactly how long the waiting will last. David knew this. He had been a shepherd. He knew what it meant to wait for morning. There were nights in the wilderness when David could look upward and see the same stars he had seen over Bethlehem. The landscape was different. The circumstances were different, but the sky was still the sky. Perhaps it reminded him that God had not changed. The God who had been present beside the sheep was present beside the cave. The God who had seen him in Bethlehem saw him now. The God who had been with him when no one knew his name was still with him when his name was spoken by kings. The fire remained a quiet symbol. Sometimes David and his companions would have needed fire for warmth. Sometimes the darkness itself became shelter. And in the silence, David could pray. The shepherd had become a fugitive, but he was still a man beneath the stars, still breathing, still waiting, still listening. There was another kind of courage in David's life. The courage to leave something unfinished. The courage to let tomorrow remain tomorrow. He had been promised a future. He did not have to seize it. That is a difficult lesson, but perhaps the hills had prepared him for it. A shepherd cannot pull the sun across the sky. He cannot force the flock to grow faster. He cannot make the grass appear instantly. He can only tend what is before him. David learned to do the same with his life. One day at a time, one path at a time, one night at a time. Eventually, David became king. But even then, the shepherd remained. The man who had known the quiet hills. The man who had watched sheep sleep. The man who had played the harp beneath the stars. The man who had learned to speak honestly to God. His life would contain both beautiful moments and painful ones. There would be victories and failures, friendships and betrayals, celebrations and grief. David was never a perfect man. The Bible does not hide his weaknesses. It shows them, but it also shows a man who repeatedly returned to God, a man who knew how to repent, a man who knew how to worship, a man who knew how to cry, a man who knew how to hope. That is part of why the Psalms continue to feel so close to the human heart. They do not require a person to pretend. They allow sorrow and trust to sit beside each other, fear and hope, silence and song. David's quiet heart. Think again of the shepherd, not the king, not the warrior, not the fugitive. The shepherd, a young man on a hillside, a flock nearby, a harp beside the fire, stars above. This is where we can return, because the early life of David teaches us something gentle. A life does not have to be impressive to be meaningful. Much of David's preparation happened when almost no one was watching. His faith grew in hidden places. His courage grew in ordinary responsibilities. His songs grew in solitude. His understanding of God deepened through long nights. There was no audience. There was no applause. There was only faithfulness. Perhaps some of your own life feels like that. Quiet, ordinary, unnoticed. Perhaps there are days when you wonder whether anything important is happening. The shepherd story reminds us that hidden seasons are still seasons of life. The quiet years are still years. The waiting is still part of the journey. David did not know what every day was preparing him for. He only knew what he had to do that day. Watch the sheep, find water, walk the path, stay awake, play the harp, pray, rest, then begin again. The Psalms often return to the language of refuge. God is a rock. God is a shelter. God is a shepherd. God is a light. These images are gentle when we let them be. A rock does not hurry. A shelter does not shout. A shepherd does not need to make noise to lead a flock. Still waters are quiet. Green pastures are quiet. The night sky is quiet. And perhaps that is why these images fit so naturally with sleep. They remind us that not everything must be solved tonight. Not every path must be understood tonight. Not every question must be answered tonight. David learned to wait, and the God David trusted was not limited by the pace of David's understanding. Imagine the hills again. The day is ending. The sheep have eaten. They are tired. One by one, they lie down. David sits beside them. The sun disappears. The sky darkens. The first stars emerge. The shepherd looks around. Nothing seems extraordinary, and yet he knows that he is not alone. Perhaps he picks up his harp. The first note is soft. The second softer still. The music does not demand attention. It simply fills the silence for a little while. Then David stops. He listens. The wind, the sheep, the fire, the distant hills, the quiet. Perhaps he whispers a prayer for the flock, a prayer for his family, a prayer for the future, a prayer he cannot put into words. Then he rests his hands and waits. There is a kind of peace in knowing that the night does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be lived. David could not see what waited beyond the darkness. Neither can we, but we do not need to. The stars do not need to explain themselves. The hills do not need to tell us what tomorrow will bring. The sheep do not worry about next week. They rest, and the shepherd watches. Beneath the same sky. Years pass quickly when we look back. The young shepherd became a warrior. The warrior became a fugitive. The fugitive became king. The king became an older man who could look back across a life filled with things he could never have imagined on those early nights. And perhaps, somewhere within all those years, the memory of Bethlehem remained. The hills, the sheep, the harp, the fire, the stars, a simpler time. Not necessarily an easier time, but a quieter time. There is a tenderness in remembering where we began. For David, the shepherd fields were not merely the background to his story. They were part of his formation. They were where he learned attention, where he learned responsibility, where he learned courage, where he learned solitude, where he learned music, where he learned to wait, and perhaps where he first learned to recognize the quiet presence of God. The shepherd's life was not glamorous. It was often lonely. But loneliness can become a place where the heart learns to listen. David's songs show a man who could speak from the depths of his soul. Sometimes he rejoiced. Sometimes he grieved. Sometimes he asked God how long. Sometimes he remembered God's faithfulness. Sometimes he simply said that God was near. This is a beautiful kind of faith. Not the faith that says everything is easy. The faith that says, even here I will trust. Even in the valley. Even in the wilderness. Even while waiting. Even when the future is hidden. Even tonight. The night grows deeper now. The hills are quieter. The fire has become smaller. The sheep are sleeping. David's harp rests beside him. Perhaps he has wrapped himself in his cloak. Perhaps he lies on the ground with the staff within reach. Above him, the stars continue their silent journey. The world is dark, but the darkness is not empty. There is life within it. There is breath. There is wind. There is the sound of sheep sleeping. And there is the quiet confidence of a shepherd who has learned that he does not have to see everything in order to rest. Perhaps this is the place to leave David for a little while. Not at the palace, not in the battle, not in the wilderness, but here, in Bethlehem, a young shepherd beneath the stars, a small fire, a sleeping flock, a harp, a quiet heart. Before the years became complicated, before the crowds, before the crown, before the songs were carried far beyond the hills, just David, watching, waiting, resting, the night rest. And now the story begins to slow. The hills around Bethlehem are quiet again. The same hills, the same open sky, the same kind of darkness. Perhaps the fire has nearly gone out. Only a few glowing embers remain. The sheep are close together. Their breathing is slow. The wind passes gently through the grass. Nothing needs to happen. The night has arrived, and the shepherd is still here. David does not need to hurry. He has done his work. The flock is safe. The day is finished. Morning will come when it comes. For now, there is only rest. Think of the hills. The slopes are soft beneath the moonlight. The distant mountains are dark against the sky. Bethlehem rests below. The paths are empty. The fields are still. And above everything, the stars. So many stars. Quiet lights across the ancient sky. David looks upward. Perhaps he remembers the words he has sung. The Lord is his shepherd. He has known green places. He has known still waters. He has walked through dark valleys. He has learned that the shepherd does not disappear simply because the path becomes dark. And tonight, there is no valley to cross, no enemy to face, no decision to make. Only night, only rest, only God. Perhaps David places his harp beside him. He lets his hands grow still. The fire gives one small flicker, then settles. A sheep moves in its sleep. The shepherd listens. Everything is quiet again. This is enough. The stars do not ask him to accomplish anything. The night does not ask him to become anything. The sheep do not ask him to explain the future. For this moment, he can simply be. And perhaps that is what rest really is. Not solving tomorrow. Not revisiting yesterday. Not carrying every unanswered question into the darkness. Simply being present. Simply breathing. Simply allowing the day to end. The Bible tells us that David knew seasons of great uncertainty. He knew what it was to wait for God's promise. He knew what it was to live without knowing exactly when deliverance would come. But tonight, beneath the stars, we can remember another truth. God was with him in the waiting, not only at the end, not only when David became king, not only when others recognized him, but in the fields, in the ordinary days, in the hidden years, in the silence. And perhaps that is where we can gently turn our thoughts now, away from David's story, toward the quiet of this night, toward the place where you are. The room around you may be dark. The world outside may be quiet. Or perhaps there are still distant sounds. A vehicle passing, a door closing, the soft movement of someone nearby. You do not need to change any of it. Let the sounds remain far away. Let the night be the night. Let this moment be simple. There is nothing you need to accomplish here. Nothing you need to prove. Nothing you need to solve before you sleep. Tomorrow will come in its own time. For now, you can rest. Perhaps there are worries from the day that are still following you. Some conversation. Some responsibility. Some uncertainty. Something you wish had gone differently. Something you cannot control. You do not need to carry all of it into the night. You can place it down. Gently, one thought at a time, like setting a heavy bag beside a fire. You can let it remain there until morning. You do not have to pick it up again tonight. God already knows what you carry. God knows the things you have not been able to explain. God knows the things you are tired of thinking about. God knows the things you are afraid to say. You do not have to find perfect words. You can simply rest. The shepherd watches over flock, and the Lord is the shepherd of his people. So tonight, let the image remain simple. Green pasture, still water, a quiet path, a shepherd nearby, a flock resting. No hurry, no fear, only the slow movement of the night. If your mind returns to tomorrow, let it return gently. You can say within yourself, tomorrow can wait, the work can wait, the decisions can wait, the answers can wait. For tonight, I can rest. For tonight, I can trust. For tonight, I'm allowed to be still. Perhaps you can imagine the hills of Bethlehem once more. The fire is low. The sheep are sleeping. David is resting beneath his cloak. His harp is beside him. The stars are above. The wind moves softly through the grass. The shepherd has finished his work for the day, and morning has not yet come. There is nothing wrong with that. Morning does not need to come early. The night can remain for a while. Let us pray quietly. God of David, God of the shepherd and the wandering heart, thank you for this night. Thank you for the quiet. Thank you for the gift of rest. For the things we carried today, we place them into your care. The things we understand, and the things we do not understand, the things we can change, and the things we cannot change. We release them now, gently. We do not need to carry tomorrow tonight. Give us peace in the darkness. Give us quiet in our thoughts. Give us rest in our bodies. Where there is worry, bring stillness. Where there is sadness, bring comfort. Where there is fear, remind us that we are not alone. Where there is uncertainty, give us patience. Teach us to trust you one day at a time. As David learned to wait among the sheep, help us to wait without fear. As David learned to sing in the quiet, help our hearts become quiet too. As David rested beneath the stars, help us remember that your care does not end when the day ends. Watch over us through this night. Watch over those we love. Be near to those who are lonely. Bring comfort to those who are hurting. Give peaceful sleep to those who are weary. And when morning comes, give us enough strength for the day that belongs to morning, not tonight. Tonight, let us rest. The prayer could become very quiet now. There is nothing more that needs to be said. The fire is low. The hills are still. The sheep are sleeping. The stars remain. And David, the shepherd, rests beneath the ancient sky, the same sky that watched over his childhood, the same sky that stretched above his waiting, the same sky beneath which he learned to trust. The same quiet heavens remain above us now. So let the night be gentle. Let your breathing become slow. Let your thoughts grow softer. If a thought comes, you do not have to follow it. Let it pass, like wind through the grass, like a cloud moving across the moon, like a note from a harp fading into silence. Let it pass. There is nothing you need to finish tonight, nothing you need to become tonight, nothing you need to understand tonight. You can simply rest. The day is finished. The night is here, and God is near. The little fire grows dim. The sheep remain together. The hills disappear into darkness. The stars shine quietly above Bethlehem. David sleeps, and the shepherd's fields become still, very still. May you rest beneath the peace of God. May your heart become quiet. May your worries grow distant. May your breathing become easy. May you remember that tomorrow does not belong to tonight. Tomorrow can wait. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for peace. Tonight is for stillness. The hills are quiet. The sheep are quiet. The fire is quiet. The harp is quiet. The night is quiet. And beneath the stars, you can rest. You can breathe. You can let go. You can sleep. God is near. And the night is safe. Rest now. Rest quietly. Rest in peace. And let the morning come when it is time.